This is the cognitive assessment lecture. It's a much shorter lecture than a typical class. The point here is just to familiarize you with one primary means of doing cognitive assessment. So when we say cognitive assessment, what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about necessarily, doing a psych evaluation of someone or like measuring their IQ or something like that. What we're really talking about is evaluating a particular set of activities or tasks or maybe a job for the cognitive workload expectations of that job. Now, since cognitive things are kind of hard to evaluate, then what you typically do instead is to kind of come at the cognitive workload from a couple different ways, a couple of different angles, maybe more than a couple, to try to zero in on it. It's not so easy to just measure directly. So we need different approaches, or we need kind of a holistic perspective. And again, we don't really get as directly at the cognitive needs or workload measurement. We don't get we're not terribly accurate at it. We just try our best to estimate it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So let's talk about how we do that. You can measure mental workload or cognitive load a lot of different ways, okay? You can measure primary or secondary tasks. You can measure physiologically. You can measure subjectively. So what are each of those things? Primary task measurement for mental workload is focusing entirely on the one primary task of interest. So if you're flying an airplane, then we're going to look at just the operation of the systems of the aircraft, right? We're not going to think about any orders that you might give to the other crew members. We're not going to think about how you interact with the passengers occasionally, or maybe talking to the ground crew or something like that. We're going to just focus on just your operation of the aircraft. So that would be focusing on just the primary task measurement. And then we would evaluate its cognitive workload there that's required. The other way of doing that would be the secondary task measure. This would be when you're doing a particular primary task, what additional reserve ability do you have to do other things, to multitask? So in order to get at this, it's kind of interesting. You would kind of have to have a primary task that you're really not measuring. And that has to be well controlled and well understood, just so that you can then introduce some background or secondary concurrent tasks and see how the performance goes there. So maybe, what I'm doing is I'm riding a bicycle, and then I occasionally have to perform some math problems in my head, right? So the bicycle riding would be the primary task, and then occasionally I might do a secondary task like a math problem, or maybe I have to, have voice. Maybe I have a headset, right, or a Bluetooth or something like that, and I have to use my voice to make a phone call, right? So that's a secondary task. So, and we really are measuring the secondary performance to determine how well those secondary tasks with the cognitive load when they're secondary instead of primary. That's what we would be doing. So that's kind of interesting. Then as far as what you measure, you can measure physiology, right? And that is when you're doing, whether it's primary, secondary, task, both, when you're doing these things, what do we actually record? Well, we can record your heart rate. We can record kind of your perspiration rate. We can record your eye movements. We can record a lot of things. Your body temperature, your breathing. We can record a lot of things to sort of get at what we think is going on cognitively, because we know that the physical and the cognitive interact. So that when you're stressed, right, your heart rate's going to go up a little bit, your blood pressure might increase, you're going to sweat a little more than when you're relaxed, right? We understand that. So we can measure physiological things to try to kind of zero in on what's the common denominator. Oh, that this particular activity is cognitively intense. Okay, but it's an estimate. It's kind of not measuring it directly, because we can't really measure very well directly. Another way of getting at it without measuring it directly is to do a subjective measurement. Whereas the physiological is objective. That means I, as the investigator, put on some measurement equipment and I get a reading off of you, whether you like it or not. That's what the reading is. Subjectively means I depend on you to tell me what the measurements are, which means you can do it based on whatever opinion or heuristic method you have of determining the answer. And this is usually, we provide kind of a survey or a set of scales to someone who's doing the activity and ask them what they think about it. And we do that in a systematic enough way with enough reliability, and maybe we ask enough people that we kind of zero in on it that way. We recognize everybody's a little different, and they might give different answers, but over time we can zero in on exactly what that is. And that's subjective measurement is what we're going to emphasize today. All right. The NASA TLX that we're going to talk about is a subjective measurement like that. So we will use the NASA Task Load Index in this course. The TLX, as it's called, is something that dates back at least 25, 30 years now. It's been around for a while. As a lot of things related to NASA start off being something kind of very focused and maybe high-tech, or at least used in high-tech environments for very limited people and limited tasks. Everything's, you do a lot of design for a very small set of users, etc. As most things with NASA, that expands. A lot of what NASA's developed has expanded out and been used for a much different set of circumstances and different people, and people don't even realize that it started with NASA. I'm not going to give you one of those history lessons, but it's fun to go look up online, what was a NASA invention that now we take for granted, things like that. Well, the NASA Task Load Index is one. Maybe you don't take it for granted, but us ergonomists have started to. It's become really the workload measure of choice. It is subjective, and it does measure cognitive workload, or at least estimate it. When we say workload, what are we really getting at? What's cognitive workload really about? Well, the best way I know to describe it is as a cost that you must pay in order to accomplish whatever the goals of the tasks are. So what kind of cost do I have to pay to succeed, or even maybe I don't succeed, but I still have to pay the cost to attempt whatever these tasks are. Cost like fatigue, right? At the end, I'm going to have really encountered a lot of fatigue. I'm going to be very fatigued. That's a cost that I pay. That fatigue could be physical. That fatigue can be mental, right? I'm cognitively, my brain is mush, they might say, right after a long exam or something like that. I'm going to have stress, perhaps. Different various levels of stress I might have to have, and sometimes stress isn't very easy to recover from. Fatigue, a good night's sleep will do wonders for fatigue a lot of times. But stress, you can wake up just as stressed as you went to bed sometimes. Perhaps there's a mistake that because of the nature of the work or the workload, it prompts a high number of mistakes. So at the end, I have this, this list, this array of errors and mistakes that have been made due to the nature of the work. Also injuries. Accidents happen, injuries happen. Sometimes you pay with injury. And there are probably other costs that you pay as a function of how intense the workload is. To do a TLX assessment, there are really 5 steps. They're not overly complex, but especially numbers 3 and 4, I'm going to want to emphasize with you exactly what that means, so I'll illustrate them on the next few slides. But we'll go over it now, right? So the first thing you need to do is to identify the tasks, or in some cases, group of tasks that are to be assessed. Now, right? But actually, that's a little bit more to it than you think. A lot of times we think of jobs. So, this person is flight engineer or astronaut or pilot or whatever this person on the screen is. I am a professor, but that doesn't mean that tells me what my tasks are. And so a lot of times we'll be ready to observe some work, or we're thinking about, products. So if we're doing assembly in a factory, all right, the products, all right, we're making widgets. Well, but my job isn't to make a widget. My job is to do some specific set of tasks. And what are those tasks? And which ones are we going to identify? Because we can't always assess them all. There may be lots of them, and Some of them don't happen every day. Some of them happen once a year when we do downtime, right? So which tasks are we going to address? And then we want to, for this particular type of assessment, we want to kind of group those tasks. Are there some similar tasks? Maybe some very different things that I do? So, I'm a professor. So what are my tasks? Well, I teach classes, right? And I teach a couple different kinds of classes. I have kind of the classroom lecture style where, I get in front of you guys, do a lot of talking, maybe you do a little talking, and then we do laboratory activities where sometimes, we just assign some activities and you guys do a lot of the work and work it out and do a lot of the talking between yourselves, and I intervene here and there. That's a little different style of teaching, right? But that's still teaching a class, so you can group those together as subtasks, or maybe you even break up the different tasks being the different courses that I teach. I teach work methods in the fall. That has a lot of lab in it, a little different. I teach ergonomics in the spring. That's more project oriented. We do more kind of conversational work, and then we do lecture stuff. And then I sometimes teach engineering economics, which is a lot more math, so we do some more demonstration of how things work, right? And even though they're all teaching, and frankly I don't teach that differently, maybe you want to separate those tasks, and because cognitively they may not be the same. The more math-intensive courses versus the more interactive courses versus maybe just the more sit in class, take notes courses, right? So maybe that's different from your usage cognitively, and so you get a different assessment. But they're close enough that you might group them together as a group teaching. And then there's other things that I do, like research stuff that we do one-on-one with the student, or which is very different, or a lot of the writing that I do, or grading papers or something like that, that's very different. And so maybe those would go in separate groups of tasks, all still within the professor position that I have. So that's kind of the way that we think about this. So again, it's a simple thing to identify the task, but it may not be. It's simple to understand what you have to do, but it may not just be trivial, right? It takes some little effort, and it sometimes takes some thinking about how best to do this. And really, if you're going to do it for multiple people, maybe, even though I may only do the task once, maybe enough of us astronauts do the same task that we group tasks together, and we can only kind of evaluate certain tasks together that all astronauts do. Even though those particular astronauts all have different jobs, they all do this one thing, and so we'll group that together, and then they all have individual things that they only do themselves, right? So you just got to be smart about how you structure, and you'll see kind of why as we go through there. The second part is you need to familiarize the subjects with their ratings and weights associated with the TLX. We mean subjects here being the people doing the job: astronauts, professors, assemblers, truck drivers, whoever it is you're studying. Okay, they need to be familiar with this. It's different than in Ruler or Reba, where you're the expert with the analysis. You just observe, and then if you have questions, you might ask specific questions. No, in the TLX, the person who needs to understand it the most is honestly the person doing the job, because they're going to subjectively answer all the questions, and they need to know what they're doing. They may not understand all of the cognitive engineering science behind the TLX, but they should at least understand what the worksheets look like that you have to fill out. So familiarity there goes a long way. Maybe an example will be great. Okay, so steps 3 and 4 is where we really collect the data. So step 3 is each subject completes a rating sheet for each task. Okay, and then step 4 is each subject performs a pairwise weighting, not rating, but weighting step for each task. And step 3, you need to do for each different task you're studying. Each person for each task. There's really no replication or grouping there. If I consider this a different task, then I need to fill out a rating, even if it's substantially similar to one I've done before. So for task A, I fill out the rating. So if I decide that teaching econ is different than teaching work methods, then I've got a work methods rating sheet that I fill out. I've got an econ sheet that I fill out. Okay, so that's how that works. It's really easy to fill out, so it's really not that cumbersome to do it several times. But the worker has to be clear on what they're being asked for each job. So usually it's a good idea to do this step while the job is being performed, or immediately after that task is being performed, so it's readily available mentally for the person to think about. Step 4 is a little trickier. Okay. Step 3, all you're doing is on a sliding scale of 0 to 100, you're just sort of saying how difficult, not really difficult, how intense certain parts of the job are. Pretty easy to do. You'll see in a second. Step 4, though, those 6 factors that we have the sliding scale for each rating sheet, we don't want to treat them equally. So we weight them. We decide that some of those factors are weighted more than others. And so there's a pairwise process, a kind of a head-to-head competition where we decide which one needs more weighting than the other. And we do that in a systematic way several times, and we get an overall weighting. It's kind of like a round robin tournament for baseball or soccer or something like that. So you got 6 teams, and they all play each other, and whoever's got the best record at the end is the champ, right? And you can sort of sort all the way down to the bottom, right? You do the same thing. And then once you do all that, then there's a step of getting the score, a little bit of math. It's pretty simple. I'll show you. So let me give you an example, since this is all kind of hard to visualize at this point. So, okay. Here are the 6 factors. And I do kind of want you to know these, all right, to be pretty familiar with them. My intent right now is not to make you do a full NASA TLX assessment in class for a grade, because you really have to be able to do the job. And then you have to have done the job. So I guess the only thing I could legitimately have you do a TLX for would be the very test that you would be taking. All right, at the end of the test, now that you've done almost all the questions, now perform a TLX assessment of the test. Okay, I could do that because that would be the only task that you would be just immediately finished doing. Okay, and I'm not going to do that. So it's not really very legitimate to ask you to do a full analysis on an exam, but understanding the different parts and maybe being able to think through some of this on an exam, I do expect. So let's go over each of these definitions. First, you have mental demand. Mental demand is, if you were doing math problems, especially challenging math problems, that would be a lot of mental demand, right? You've got to do some complex math, especially if you're doing it in your head. You're doing calculations. You're remembering prior steps in order to, do the second step of the calculation, that kind of thing. So for example, if you read off 10 numbers to me and then told me to tell you the average, I could do it. If you did it slowly, it would be a lot easier. If you're doing it, if I say, all right, here are the grades, 100, 90, 90, 80, 100, 70, 80. If I think through that, I will probably have the average for you, or at least within a point. But right now, I'm like, I don't know what I said, right? That's a mentally demanding thing to ask somebody, especially to do it pretty quick. Doesn't necessarily mean it's terribly complex, right? Then I could also ask you to give me, the first derivative of 4x cubed minus 3x squared, plus y squared minus z, all right, plus 6. And, okay, that's really challenging. I don't even know if you even know what you're talking about, Piper, right? That's a little more complex, right? Do that in your head and give it to me. Mentally demanding. There's lots of other mentally demanding things. Remembering a series of things, searching for things. So like I'm doing a Where's Waldo puzzle, right? And I'm trying to find Waldo in the picture. Even that's kind of mentally demanding, right? I'm doing a lot of processing of signal information. So here are the ways we ask this. Was the task easy or demanding, simple or complex, exacting or forgiving? Those are kind of contrast here. So is it easy or demanding? All right. And again, we're sort of meaning not physically easy necessarily. We're meaning like mentally what you have to do in your head. Is it easy or demanding? Simple or complex? Exacting or forgiving? Now, easy and simple are the low end of mental demand, and then forgiving would be the low end of mental demand. So maybe we should reverse the order of these last two terms, exacting, forgiving. Maybe it should be forgiving or exacting in order to keep it in that nice low to high way of writing it. But you get the idea. Exacting meaning that, I need to know to the nearest hundredth of a decimal place, right? The answer to this question, as opposed to give me a ballpark average, of the high temperatures of the last week, and when I tell you that they were 50, 55, 60, 40, 35, and 60, right? Give me a ballpark within 10. Oh, well, 45 or 50. We'll say 50, right? That's probably right. Give me to the third decimal place. That's very exact. That's going to require a lot more mental demand. All right, probably more than you need to know about mental demand. Physical demand, it's what it sounds like. They're pushing, pulling, turning, activating, moving. So speed is important here. So I'm having to do very repetitive things very quickly, right? Physically quickly, not just thinking, but I'm actually having to act quickly. Is there slack or is it strenuous? So slack being, more about there's downtime. I may have to go move fast for a second, but then I'm downtime for a while. Then I'm fast and downtime. Or is it very consistent, restful, or laborious? They're just different synonyms, way of writing it. Physical demand. So why are we putting physical demand in a cognitive workload assessment? Well, these things aren't independent. Okay, I cannot physical things. If I have a high physical demand, some of you are maybe better at shutting your brain off. You're going to go and dig a ditch or whatever. You're not going to be thinking that much about it, but not usually. You're going to be mentally tired somewhat from doing physically tiring things, and vice versa. You're going to be physically tired from doing mentally tiring things. After a 4-hour exam, you go take the FE exam for 6 hours, something like that. If you're tired, you probably want to take a nap, physically too, not just mentally. These things are related, and you'll notice all 6 of these. There's overlap. You can usually find at least one of the other factors where, you're like, you'll have something you'll be like, I don't know what the difference is between frustration level and good performance, right? They're interlocked. Yes, they are interrelated, but usually you can think of a way that they're different. And so all this is really trying to do is NASA says, all right, workload is some combination of these 6 things. Even though these things aren't completely independent, they're different enough that we can conceive of scenarios where one might be more important than another, or more significant, higher, lower, whatever. And so we'll go ahead and treat them all as separate things, even though we recognize there's some overlap, and that's okay. It's a subjective workload measurement anyway. Temporal demand, what's that? Well, temporal demand is how much time pressure do you feel? So it's not just repetition, is finishing on time like super important? Is it demanding? Is it difficult to keep up? Is it frantic? That's kind of a good word for this. So what do you feel about the time demands? Temporal means time. Effort. This just seems very generic, I know, right now. You're like, effort, that's really generic. How hard did you have to work mentally and physically to accomplish your level of performance? And you're like, all right, I already answered mental and I answered physical, and now I'm answering effort, which is both mental and physical. And the correct answer is yes. Something can be demanding. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a lot of effort. They're probably related, but anyway, these are kind of requirements. The demands are kind of like what the requirements were. And then effort, performance, and frustration level are kind of like what your experience was. And again, they're very related, but they're not completely the same. And so what was your experience with how much effort you put in? Was it low or high or in the middle or whatever? Performance is you actually evaluating your success in accomplishing the goals that you had. How satisfied were you with your performance in accomplishing the goals? Not just did it feel good, but I mean the goals. Do you feel like you succeeded, right? And you're like, it's not just yes or no or good or poor performance. I mean, they're various degrees. So, well, I succeeded somewhat. I didn't do as much as I wanted. It wasn't quite as good. My commission this month, I didn't make as much as I usually do, but it was a pretty good month, right? You can have different degrees of this. And then the last one here is frustration level. How insecure, discouraged, irritated, stressed, and annoyed were you, right? Versus gratified, content, relaxed, complacent, which doesn't necessarily sound like a good thing, but so you just sort of evaluate how you feel about it in the end. You could have very poor performance and still enjoy yourself, like every time I've ever played golf. All right, actually, sometimes I've been very frustrated and still enjoyed myself, which almost seems counterintuitive, right? All right. I want you to know these 6 things. I want you to have a good feel for each one of them. And you need it in order to do the TLX. Okay, what is this? Well, this is kind of the pen and paper version, and I'm going to illustrate the pen and paper version for you. I'll show you a slide with the computerized version. Probably more people use the computerized version just because you'll see it just kind of simplifies the data collection process a little bit. It's not any more accurate or anything like that. So you can use the pen and paper. So what would you do in the paper based? Each one of these little squares, you cut them out, and you'd have a little card, a note card or whatever, that has like this, effort or performance, and you would ask the subject, which one is more important? Which one should be weighted more important for this particular task? Or group of tasks. For the weighting, you can weight maybe more than one task if they're similar enough. You can kind of weight them the same. So for example, teaching. If I'm going to do my job and I'm going to say, well, weight for me the importance of teaching any course. It doesn't matter what course it is. It doesn't matter what teacher it is, what major it is. Just, college, professor, teaching. Let's go through the weighting process. And we might do that. And then you would ask me to rate each one of these things individually for each task, and they may vary a little bit. But the weighting with a W, weighting would be the same. Boy, Elmer Fudd would have a really hard time with this lecture. He would get confused with waiting and waiting. Ha ha ha. Anyway, I wonder if I can delete that last segment. Effort or performance, and you just pick one. And then you pull a random one out of the hat, and there's 15 of these cards. Temporal demand or effort, physical demand or frustration, and you just keep up with it by marking them on the tally mark. So you see here are the 6 scales. Each time you pull a card out of the hat, you decide which one is most important. You make a little mark. Boop. Physical demand wins one little head-to-head matchup. And there are 15 of those head-to-head matchups to completely do a round-robin competition between all 6 of these scales. And so any one of them will have 5 comparisons. And so if mental demand won every time, it would have 5 tally marks, which means it would get a weighting of 5 here in the box. That's it. That's how it works. And then you can do a total count. You can add up all the weights. They should add up to 15 because that means you didn't miss one or do an error. Okay, so that's just a check. All right, so that is the weighting part. The rating with an R is done per task, per person, individually. And all you do here is you think about the job that you were evaluating, or the task, I should say. How mentally demanding was the task? And notice it's in past tense. You have to have done it to do this. Okay. So what I do is I just simply kind of draw a line, make a mark on this scale somewhere along it. Very high, very low, right? If I do it right in the middle, then it's in the middle. It's 50%. This is a 0 to 100 scale. This mark here is 0. This mark here is 100. They're not numbered because we want you not to be biased by the numerical value. So for some people, 50 means half of 100, medium, halfway, median. But other people, 50 means failing, right? Fail, F. Oh, I don't want to fail. So we're not biasing you by putting a number, but that's what it is, and there's an easy way to count it. You just count up every box, 5, 10, 15, 20. And so whenever you encounter the box, or the mark, I should say, whatever box it's in, include that box, and that's it. So if it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, and we're in this box where our mark is, then it's 40. We get a 40 value for that value. Okay? That's how that works. So how mentally demanding was it? How physically demanding was it? How hurried or rushed was the pace? How successful were you in accomplishing what you were asked to do? That's performance. How hard did you have to work to accomplish your level of performance? That's effort. How insecure, discouraged, irritated, stressed, and annoyed were you? Let me point out something. Very high, very high, very high. Failed, very high, very high. Performance is the only one that has a different scale. So if you did very well, where does it go? The mark goes way over here on the low end of the scale. If it was very mentally demanding, it goes here. Very physically demanding, it goes here on the right end. Very temporal demanding is here. Very much effort, and if you're very frustrated, but you're here would be very, very bad performance. And to some people, that's not intuitive. So just remember, this has an opposite scale. All right, the last thing that you do to score this is you go back to here, you get your weight for mental demand, say it's a 5, and you put it here, 5. Physical demand, 4. Temporal demand, 3. Performance, 2. Effort, 1. Frustration, 0. And yes, you can have a 0 weight. All that means is when you did those little pairwise comparisons, frustration or whatever, never won. It was never the most important factor for any one of those pairs, which is very legitimate, and you have a 0 weight. Now, the way you score that, what that weight does is it actually means that factor will not contribute to your final evaluation. I'm a little uncomfortable with that. If I were designing this, I would have it contribute a minimum amount, but I didn't design it. We'll trust those guys at NASA. Raw rating, that's where you take the numerical value you get over here from the scale. So you've got a mark right there. So you go, 50, 60, 60, or 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, and it was right there on the 80 mark. So we write down 80, right, for mental demand as a rating. So then we multiply our rating times our weight. In our example, we had 5 times 80 is a 400. Okay, we go through and we get those values, we add them all up, we get a final number. A lot of times that final number will be anywhere from 600 to 1200. It can be pretty high. And then we normalize that by dividing by 15, and what that will do is that'll give us a number that could be between 0 and 100. The higher the value, the more cognitively intense the workload is. The lower the value, the more cognitively not intense, I guess, the workload is. As a rule of thumb, this is really just my rule, anything over 50 is going to get my attention. It's not, but it kind of depends on the job that you're comparing to. So what does this number really mean? Well, there's not it's not like Rula where it's like, oh, a 6 means change soon, the 7 means change now, and it's very high. It's not quite like that. It's really just a relative scale. So, you might do 5 jobs, and you're like, all right, this is the one this one's a 70, and all the others were 50. So I know the 70 one is my most cognitively intense, right? That's really kind of how you could evaluate this. It's subjective, and therefore it's kind of relative. But I can make some changes, reassess, and see if I lower my score, right? That's a very legitimate thing to do. I can compare across different jobs to figure out which one needs to be improved. All right, this person is doing 6 tasks. One of them's a 60. All the others are 35s. Wow, that's the one that's really going to be most likely to result in errors and mistakes, or the person's going to feel the most fatigue and stress from. Is there some way I can change how that job is done to lower it? Or maybe I'm not going to give this person this job to do 7 out of 8 hours of every day. Maybe I can rotate that stressful job through to other people, or maybe I can go and error proof some of the things so it's harder to make mistakes, so that or if there are mistakes, it is not disaster, right? We have a little redundancy, or do something that will address the fact that you are aware of the cognitive workload of this job. That's really how we're going to use this, okay? And I will say this number that you get, this final number, a lot of times we really like final numbers. Man, we're engineers. We really like to get the answer. People often stop and they don't go all the way and get this answer. Because this answer, this weighting system, it's valuable. There's been some studies to show that it's pretty good at predicting things. But not everybody really trusts that. They really like the rating scale here, this 0 to 100 scale of these 6 factors. They really like this better than the weighting part of it. Some people do. And so they'll ignore the weights. They'll just do a 0 to 100 6 times, and they'll just kind of work with that. And they'll call that raw TLX. So they ignore the weight part. They don't do the pairwise comparisons. They don't do this last math. And they'll just simply say, all right, my job's got a 75 mental demand and a 50 physical and a 40 temporal. And they'll just kind of work with those 6 numbers and figure out ways of improving from that. That's called a raw TLX. Take it or leave it. I like the full version myself. I like getting to the number. These are the results graphically portrayed. I don't really care for this. So, I'm probably not going to be giving it to you anytime soon, but I do want you to be aware. Okay, overall workload, that's OW, which is annoying. Mean of weighted ratings. Okay, so 50.33 is the overall workload, so kind of in the middle. Okay, from a cognitive point of view. But what does that mean? Where did it come from? Here are the 6 factors, right? Physical demand, mental demand, temporal demand, operator performance, effort, and frustration. They're not in the same order, by the way, as the ones we just did, but that's all right. Which one was rated the highest? Well, 80, right? This mental demand was an 80 on the rating side. That's the 0 to 100 rating. Which one was weighted the highest? Well, also mental demand. Here is the weighting. And you can see the little marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is 5 wide, which means it was a 5. Its weighting was a 5. It won all the competitions. Temporal demand, look, it was rated 40, so it wasn't insignificant. It was a 40 out of 100. But notice, it was only weighted 1. It only had a 1 weighting. And so really the ultimate result here is kind of the area within each box. The bigger the area, the more of a contribution it makes towards the overall workload. So you can see that this one here, frustration, doesn't make much of a contribution, right? But mental demand is really high. So a lot of mental demand in this job, not a lot of frustration, I guess. Again, take it or leave it, this graphical portrayal. It's a way of communicating all that stuff we got from the entire analysis all in one graph, I guess, so it has a value, but I don't really care for it personally. Oops. Here is a screenshot from the electronic version, or one of the many electronic versions. Just like anything produced by the government, once it's declassified anyway, it's supposed to be readily available to everyone. It's not, you don't charge for it. So NASA said, here's our system, go figure out how to use it. And a lot of people went out and made little software versions. Most of them are free, you shouldn't pay for it, but there probably are people trying to sell it. But anyway, you can see how you do it. You get this screen, you move these little red sliders up, right? Again, you don't have the number, so you just kind of qualitatively figure out how high you want it to go for each one. Right, here's the little descriptors. A lot of these you can go in and edit how physically demanding was the task. You can edit it to be specific to the job you're doing, maybe. And then the next screens would be individual pairwise comparisons, performance versus effort. You click the one that wins. Click, click, click. Let's go to the next one. 15 times, 15 seconds later, you're done. And then it tallies up all the scores and gives it to you. So it can actually be done pretty fast. You can do a lot of people all at once with this. Oops. All right. That is the NASA TLX. Thanks for staying with me on that. I like this little chart. Kind of talks about both underload and overload from a workload point of view. Both can kind of be bad, right? Okie doke.